Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we transform dense academic history and complex theoretical concepts into crystal clear, unforgettable insights.
Hello?
Today, we are undertaking a massive deep dive into something that really fundamentally shapes how we understand ourselves and the world around us: qualitative inquiry.
It's a field that, people often reduce to just interviews and observations versus hard statistics.
Right, the soft stuff versus the numbers.
Exactly. But its history is a really fascinating story of deep philosophical struggle. We're going to be tracing the evolution of its foundational assumptions, tracking these huge historical crises of authority.
And exploring how those challenges forced researchers to completely rethink how they study human social life. It's quite a journey.
It really is.
Our source material for this deep dive is a comprehensive historical chapter that tracks this evolution. And I mean, it stretches from ancient intellectual traditions all the way up to the modern dilemmas of, what counts as science in fields like education and sociology.
And our mission for you, the listener, is pretty straightforward.
Yeah. We want to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding this complex intellectual journey that researchers took, moving beyond, I guess, the easier task of just counting thing.
To the infinitely more difficult challenge of capturing human meaning.
Okay, so let's unpack this right at the start. To even begin to understand the history, we have to grasp the core distinction. What is qualitative inquiry fundamentally about? What are its immediate philosophical demands?
It really all starts with the Latin roots, and the distinction is so crucial because it highlights the entire difference in focus. We're dealing with qualitas versus quantitas.
Okay, quantitas is pretty self-explanatory.
Right. That refers obviously to a focus on differences in amount, how much, how many.
But qualitas, that's different.
Qualitas refers to the primary focus on qualities, on features and distinctions in kind.
So it's not about how much of something there is, but about what makes that something what it is, its unique characteristics.
Precisely. The qualitative question seeks to discover and describe, narratively, what people do in their everyday lives and this is the crucial part, what their actions mean to them.
So the central task is identifying these meaning-relevant kinds of things.
Kinds of people, kinds of actions, kinds of beliefs, kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't define the kind, you can't describe the quality. It's that foundational.
Which means the core question is something like, what are the kinds of material and symbolic things that people in this setting orient themselves to as they conduct their lives?
Exactly. And that sounds like it should be a prerequisite for any kind of research, even quantitative, right?
It absolutely does.
And this brings us to what our source calls the quantitative trap.
The quantitative trap. I like that. What is it?
So quantitative research asks, how many instances of a certain kind are there?
Okay.
But the analysis goes haywire when it tries to shortcut the qualitative foundations. That's a direct quote from the source.
What does that mean? It goes haywire.
It means if you haven't first done the essential qualitative work of identifying the meaning-relevant kinds of things, you just end up counting the wrong things. You might, count eye blinks when you should be interpreting winks.
That's a great distinction. One is a physical action, the other is a social action full of meaning.
Exactly. And you can't tell the difference without first understanding the kind of action you're looking for.
So the measurement is only as good as the classification system you put in place beforehand. You have to understand what you're measuring before you can meaningfully count how much of it there is.
You've got it.
Mm.
And this entire endeavor, this whole struggle to define kinds and capture meaning, rests on what our source identifies as 6 foundational footings.
6 footings. Okay, like the pillars of the field.
Exactly. And when we talk about the history of qualitative inquiry, we are essentially detailing the contestation and the redefinition of these 6 pillars over time.
All right, let's walk through them because it sounds like they really define the scope of the entire debate. What's the first one?
The first footing is disciplinary perspectives. Historically, these have been dominated by sociology and anthropology. They're the fields that provide the historical methods and, the conceptual tools.
Okay, so the academic home bases. What's second?
Second, we have the role of the researcher themselves,
Yep.
the participant observational field worker. This is the person doing the observing, but they're also the author, which, well, that immediately injects subjectivity right into the heart of the process.
Of course. Then third must be the other side of that coin.
It is. The third is the people who are observed, who are historically called research subjects. The debate over their role, whether they're just passive subjects or active collaborators, is absolutely central to the field's later crises.
I can imagine. So after the people involved, the focus moves outward to the research itself.
Yes, to the output and its context. So the fourth footing is The rhetorical and substantive content of the research report as a text.
So how is the report actually written? What voice is used? How does it try to establish its truth claim?
Precisely. And that's tied directly to the fifth footing, the audiences to which such texts have been addressed.
Right. Are they written for fellow academics, for policymakers, or crucially for the people who were studied in the first place?
And that choice, that audience, drastically affects the entire research agenda. It changes everything.
And the last one must be the big one, the one that holds it all up.
It is. The sixth and final footing is the massive one, the underlying worldview of research. We are talking about ontology, what is real, epistemology, how do we know it, and the ultimate purposes of the inquiry. Why are we even doing this?
Wow.
The intense contestation of these six footings. That's what makes the history of qualitative inquiry so dynamic and, frankly, so politically charged.
With those fittings established, we can start to trace the intellectual DNA. And it's kind of comforting to know that descriptive social inquiry didn't just pop up in a 20th century university department.
Not at all. Its roots stretch way back to the ancient world.
So who were the original comparative social observers? Who was the first person to, look at another culture and write it down systematically?
We can probably start with Herodotus, back in the 5th century BCE.
Herodotus, the historian.
The very same. He was a Greek scholar who wrote these extensive cross-cultural comparisons. He derived his knowledge from accounts given to him by travelers, and he compiled all this information on disparate human lifeways.
So he was kind of crowdsourcing his data.
In a way, yes. And in doing so, he essentially provided the foundational structure for comparative knowledge about human societies that, remained dominant right up until the formalization of anthropology in the late 19th century.
So he wasn't just recording random observations, he was creating an intellectual groundwork for understanding different cultural systems.
Absolutely. You could think of him as the original cultural relativist, recognizing that social norms were not universal. This tradition was then carried forward later by figures like the Greek skeptical philosopher Sextus Empiricus.
When was he active?
In the 2nd century CE, he compiled a really detailed cross-cultural survey of morality, and his insight was profoundly important.
In what way?
By showing that what was considered right in one society was often considered deeply wrong in another, he established this observed tradition of cultural relativity. This was a direct intellectual counterpunch to the idea of universal, natural, moral laws.
So this tradition of detailed description and cross-cultural comparison really flourished then during the Renaissance and Baroque eras, but maybe in more practical ways.
Yes, exactly. The 16th and 17th centuries saw this explosion of highly descriptive how-to-do-it books.
How-to-do-it books? Like what?
These weren't academic treatises. They were guides on everything from the nuances of courtly dancing and the etiquette of fishing to the really complex skill of improvising on the violin. They all relied on meticulously observed, descriptive narrative detail to convey tacit knowledge.
And outside of these practical arts, we also saw narrative reports of massive social themes, often driven by colonial expansion.
Exactly. We see these deeply narrative descriptive reports emerging about Native American accounts in Latin America by figures like Bartolomé de las Casas.
Yeah.
He meticulously documented the customs and lives of indigenous peoples.
And wasn't he often doing it to critique the colonial violence?
He was. It was a form of advocacy. And similarly, the French Jesuit reports from North America in the 16th and 17th centuries were incredibly detailed, narrative descriptions of specific cultural groups. These reports were foundational because they established the value of dense narrative description of human life in context.
But all of this descriptive narrative work, it sort of hits a historical roadblock with the rise of the Enlightenment, right? With figures like Galilei and Newton. Suddenly, narrative descriptions were no longer considered the gold standard of truth.
That was the crucial divergence.
Right.
That's the moment that set the stage for the next 3 centuries of debate. The Enlightenment established the firm idea that knowledge should be developed primarily, if not exclusively, quantitatively. The new standard became the search for general, universal laws that apply uniformly throughout the physical world.
A realist ontology, as the source puts it.
Exactly. The belief that physical processes are constant and independent of the observer, which allows for clear prediction and the discovery of unchanging universal truth.
And this ambition, this desire for universal laws, it immediately spills over into social studies.
It does. It created what was then termed social physics. They were literally trying to treat human motivation like mathematical vectors.
So a direct attempt to import the methodology of Newtonian mechanics into the study of society.
That's it. You have Pierre Petty's Political Arithmetic in 1690, which was an early, influential English attempt to generalize social processes using frequency data, looking at birth rates, death rates, financial figures.
And this is where the term statistics comes from.
This is actually where the term statistics began, information collected for the state. Enlightenment thinkers truly believed social processes could be mathematically modeled, searching for constant conjunctions between events. If X happens, Y will happen with predictable regularity.
But that tension must have been there from the start. I mean, if you're Auguste Comte and you want to find the gravity of society, when did researchers start to realize that human motivation just wouldn't follow those general laws?
That tension simmered throughout the entire 19th century. And ironically, the very field of sociology was founded on that quantitative, law-seeking side.
Was Comte himself?
Yes, in 1822, he developed sociology explicitly advocating for it to be modeled after the physical sciences. He called it social physics. And the early anthropologists like Tyler and Morgan, they aimed for universal generalization, trying to classify human cultures evolutionarily from, barbarism to modern civilization.
They were looking for a seamless web of science where social life was just a more complicated extension of physical laws.
Exactly. But the intellectual alternative, the necessary counter-movement, appeared in Germany. This is where Wilhelm Dilthey stepped in during the 1880s.
And he advocated for something called Geisteswissenschaften.
Literally, sciences of the spirit,
Wow.
or what we now call the human sciences.
Geisteswissenschaften. That's a powerful, almost mysterious term. For you, the listener, who might be unfamiliar with that philosophical concept, how is that different from just observing external behavior? Why was that concept so explosive in challenging the model of social physics?
Well, think about it. If physics is about the external world operating independently of my belief, and the method is measuring and calculating constant processes,
Okay.
then the study of the spirit, or of human consciousness, must adopt a fundamentally different method. Dilthey argued that human social life is characterized by meaning, purpose, and values, things that don't exist independently of human consciousness.
So you can measure the frequency of an action, but you haven't understood it until you grasp the meaning the actor gives to it.
Precisely. The purpose of inquiry shifts from predicting external behavior to understanding internal meaning.
The purpose becomes understanding, or as Dilthey called it, Verstehen.
Exactly. Verstehen is the intellectual alternative to the quantitative pursuit of constant laws. It puts the subjective experience and interpretation of the actor right at the center.
So when we study history or society, we aren't studying objects devoid of meaning.
We're studying other human minds, and that requires an interpretive, qualitative approach. This philosophical footing became absolutely essential for justifying the qualitative research methodology that developed later in the 20th century, especially through the work of people like Max Weber and the interpretive anthropology of Clifford Geertz.
Okay, so the intellectual foundation is set. We need Verstehen. We need understanding, not just social physics. Now we have to move from philosophy to standardized practice. If the goal is to understand meaning, the vehicle for doing that became ethnography.
Right. The term ethnography became standardized in the last quarter of the 19th century. It was used by anthropologists to describe these detailed accounts of the lifeways of particular local sets of people.
And we have to acknowledge the context here.
We do. In its professionalized form, these studies were almost always conducted on groups in colonial situations, far removed from the Western research institutions that commissioned the studies.
And the etymology of the word itself is incredibly telling about that dynamic.
It really is. It combines a Greek grapheme, which means to write, and ethnoi, the nations, the others.
The others.
Crucially, the term ethnoi initially carried pejorative implications. It was historically used to contrast the Greeks with the xenoi, or foreigners. So the earliest professional definition of ethnography was essentially the descriptive writing about non-Western people.
So they had the philosophical mandate, but they needed an instruction manual, right? A how-to guide for performing this observation and collection of facts in the field.
They absolutely needed to standardize the methodology, especially since the early researchers were often travelers or colonial residents, not formally trained academics.
And this is where that manual comes in.
Yes, in 1874, the British Society for the Advancement of Science published the seminal Notes and Queries on Anthropology. This was the guide designed to systematize data collection, covering observation and interviewing for those traveling or residing in, and I'm quoting here, uncivilized lands.
And the source mentions some fascinating details about this manual, highlighting how focused they were on practical, objective measurement.
Oh, it was a truly practical artifact of its time. The book was small, only 6.5 by 4 inches, designed specifically to fit into a pocket.
Very convenient.
And to ensure consistent measurements, it actually had rulers printed right on the edge.
No way.
Yes, to help observers readily measure artifacts and objects they encountered in the field. The goal was rigorous precision, summarized as an accurate collection of facts and a comprehensive description of the whole way of life of those who were being studied.
An instruction manual for objective realism.
That's exactly what it was.
But that objective of accurate facts is still firmly rooted in the Enlightenment's pursuit of objectivity. The source highlights, though, that early American qualitative pioneers used these descriptive methods not just for objective classification, but specifically for advocacy and social reform.
That is the essential transition from detached science to applied social purpose. And the work of W.E.B. Du Bois is absolutely paramount here.
The Philadelphia Negro.
His 1899 study, The Philadelphia Negro, is considered the first monograph of modern realist ethnography. Du Bois didn't just study a far-off culture, he focused on a specific African-American census tract, combining demographic data, area maps, and detailed community history.
So he was using both quantitative measures like demographics and these deep qualitative descriptions to argue against the prevailing stereotypes of disorder.
Exactly. He meticulously described the lives and the orderliness of people who were traditionally invisible and voiceless in academic and political discussions. His work, along with Charles Booth and the Webbs in East London in 1891, and the muckraking journalism of someone like Jacob Riis.
They were all explicitly designed to advocate for and influence social reform.
Absolutely. They use systematic observation to document facts about poverty and behavior, and they align themselves with social reformers rather than purely detached scientists.
This inherent dual purpose, describing the world accurately and simultaneously trying to change it, is a tension that, as we'll see, became explosive later on. But before that explosion, practitioners had to figure out how to capture meaning. And that required the conceptual distinction between emic and ekic.
This distinction is arguably the single most important conceptual tool developed in early qualitative research. It helps us understand the difference between describing mere surface behavior and describing meaningful social action.
Okay, let's define them clearly for everyone listening. What is etic?
The term etic refers to the content and epistemological status of the description as observed by an outsider, using criteria and language external to the culture being studied. It's the measurable, observable physical event, like an eye blink.
Okay, the outsider's view, the physical fact. So emic is the insider's view.
The emic perspective, exactly. It demands that we describe action in ways that convey the subjective orientations and meaning perspectives of those whose conduct is being reported.
So the famous distinction, counting the eye blink versus interpreting the wink. The blink is physiological, the wink is cultural.
Perfect analogy. The quantitative etic approach would count how many times an eye closes. But the qualitative emic approach has to interpret the kind of closure. Was it fatigue, a nervous static, or was it a culturally loaded gesture conveying shared knowledge, a wink? The meaning of the action is irrelevant to the Inikau scientist, but it's everything to the emic ethnographer.
Can we apply this to a more practical, modern application, say in educational research? If a researcher is counting interactions in a classroom, what would an etic observation be, and how would an emic perspective fundamentally change the interpretation of that count?
That's a great application point.
Got it.
Okay, so an etic study of classroom interactions might involve meticulously counting the frequency of student interruptions during a lecture.
Okay.
An etic researcher might simply conclude, this classroom has a high incidence of disorderly interruptions. The quantitative measure would indicate a behavioral problem.
Right. High frequency equals disruption. Simple.
But an emic researcher who has spent months immersed in the local culture of that classroom or that community might discover something entirely different. They might find that in that specific pedagogical culture, interrupting the speaker is understood not as a sign of disorder,
But as a sign of something else.
but as a culturally sanctioned signal of engaged learning or intellectual enthusiasm. The interruption is, in fact, an expected and valued kind of interaction.
Wow. So in this case, the emic interpretation changes the entire meaning of the etic count from problem to pedagogical success.
Completely. And that shift from measuring behavior to interpreting meaning is the philosophical leap that qualitative research made.
That conceptual leap allowed for the real institutionalization of the field. And now we enter what the source calls the golden age of realist ethnography. This runs roughly from the 1920s into the post-World War II era. So what defined this classical approach to fieldwork?
This was the peak of the ambition that was set by those British guidebooks. The approach was labeled realist because the narrator adopted this anonymous, distant, third-person voice.
The voice of God narrator.
You could say that, yeah. It was intended to be objective. The goal was comprehensive description, a complete portrait of a whole way of life, whether that was a single village, a remote island, or an organizational structure.
And the narrative conveyed an impression of complete detachment, intending to capture the native's point of view without allowing the author's own biases or personal presence to interfere.
It was the voice of the all-knowing expert, reporting a singular, objective reality, as if they were a divine camera just documenting everything.
And the foundational text that codified this high standard was Bronislaw Malinowski's 1922 monograph, Argonauts of the Western Pacific.
Absolute foundational. Malinowski insisted that ethnographic description must be holistic and accurate, and his goal was, and I'm quoting him, to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, his vision of his world.
And his methodology, the enforced fieldwork he conducted, that became the benchmark for all future ethnographers.
It did. It's a fascinating story. Malinowski, being Polish, was restricted by British colonial authorities during World War I while he was in the Trobriand Islands. He was basically forced into 4 years of intensive, enforced field work.
So it wasn't by choice initially.
No, but he used this time to achieve total immersion, learning the local language and living completely embedded in the community. He took this necessary restriction and codified it into a virtue. He argued that only this level of deep immersion could yield a report that truly grasped the system of everyday life and local meaning in its entirety.
And he formalized this intensive immersion into the 3 requirements of adequate ethnography. These are key because they define what intellectual rigor meant during this golden age.
They absolutely are. These requirements set the empirical benchmark for decades.
So what was the first one?
The first was the organization of the tribe and anatomy of its culture. This required concrete statistical documentation.
Okay, so numbers were still in there.
Oh, yeah. An ethnographer had to map out the physical structures, the kinship rules, the economic transactions, the political organization of the community, and a firm, clear outline, the structural blueprint of the society.
A baseline quantitative framework was essential for credibility.
Absolutely. The second requirement was capturing the imponderabilia of actual life and type of behavior.
The imponderabilia.
The things you can't easily count. This was the qualitative meat of the work, collected through minute, detailed observations field notes made by maintaining close, persistent contact with native life.
So specific examples of subtle, everyday behavior that couldn't be statistically documented, but were essential for capturing daily reality.
Exactly. The flow of market chatter, the specific expressions of mourning, the casual interactions between children and elders, the subtle, unstated assumptions and rules that give culture its texture.
I see. And the third?
And third, he required a collection of ethnographic statements, narratives, typical utterances, corpus inscriptionum. These were the documents of native mentality, captured verbatim folklore, stories, magical formulae, transcripts of conversations.
So taken together, these 3 bodies of evidence, the structural map, the daily observations, and the verbatim accounts, were intended to guarantee the objectivity, accuracy, and holism of the account.
That was the ideal.
While Malinowski was setting the standard in anthropology, the source notes that this detailed ethnographic methodology was also being rapidly adopted by American sociology, particularly by the famed Chicago School.
That's right. The Chicago School, championed by people like Robert Park and Ernest Burgess, strongly encouraged this observational approach. They effectively took the methodologies that were designed for remote islands and applied them to the complexities of the American city.
And that's a critical shift.
It is. It moves the focus from faraway others to the differentiated life of urban neighborhoods and immigrant groups right at home.
Why did the American urban environment lend itself so well to the ethnographic approach? What made Chicago a good lab?
Well, the city, especially Chicago at that time, was seen as a living laboratory, a massive ecosystem where different groups, immigrants, transients, segregated communities lived in close proximity but operated by totally different localized social rules.
And traditional survey data could only tell you so much.
Right, survey data could tell you what groups lived where, but ethnography was needed to understand how those groups organized, what their localized cultures were, and how they adapted to urban life.
And what were some of the resulting classic American ethnographies from that period?
We see Louis Wirth's 1928 study of the West Side Jewish ghetto and subsequent seminal works focusing on ethnic neighborhoods, documenting how social organization played out in specific urban spaces. Most prominently, Robert and Helen Lind conducted a sweeping two-volume study of Middletown.
Which was Muncie, Indiana, right?
That's right. It was a deep analysis of the social structure of a small Midwestern city. And after the war, this approach broadened out significantly, moving into institutional settings.
So ethnography went from the island to the ghetto to the office.
Exactly. The post-war era saw ethnography deployed in workplace studies, focusing on labor management relations and internal business organization. Researchers used participant observation to deeply describe the daily work in bank departments, businesses, and factories.
And it proved its utility.
It did, by showing how complex social systems operated internally, examining interactions, power dynamics, and communication flows that simple statistical surveys would entirely miss. This period also saw the first use of portable video and audio equipment in the 1960s to capture interactional data in classrooms and workplaces for detailed discourse analysis.
Okay, so the Golden Age was built on this real confidence that the objective narrator, using Malinowski's rules, could capture a stable, holistic truth. But that confidence, which the source calls the normal science paradigm of the Golden Age, it started to collapse in the post-WWII era.
It did. It was driven by this deep skepticism about accuracy and validity.
It was a true crisis in the foundational footings of the field.
It was. And the first intellectual confrontation that really showed the limits of objective realism was the Tepoztlan controversy, which was centered on a small village in Mexico.
Let's detail that study because it perfectly illustrates how the researcher's lens dictates the reality they see.
It really does. So Robert Redfield studied the village of Tepoztlan in 1930. He was heavily influenced by functionalism, which is a theoretical lens that seeks harmony and internal consistency within a social system.
And so that's what he found.
That's what he described. He described the village as orderly, integrated, and functioning harmoniously. Then, 17 years later, Oscar Lewis restudied the exact same village in 1951.
And Lewis had a different lens.
A very different one. Lewis was influenced by Marxist conflict theory, which posits that tension, struggle, and oppression are the fundamental realities of social life.
And so he found tension, anger, and deep individual struggle, completely contradicting Redfield's orderly portrait.
His findings were radically different. He described profound tension, anger, factionalism, and individual villagers struggling against the systems that Redfield had portrayed as stable.
Which raised an immediate, inescapable question. Was the difference due to 17 years of social change, or was it because of the theoretical framework's functionalism versus conflict theory that each researcher imposed on the data?
That was the devastating question. The implication was that the objective description wasn't a stable reality discovered by the researcher, but a product manufactured by the researcher's chosen theory.
It challenged the whole Enlightenment assumption of a singular, objective social reality just waiting to be observed.
It did. The Tepoztlan controversy showed that the theoretical framework was inseparable from the empirical findings. The field of qualitative research had to confront the fact that its descriptions were always, in some way, interpretive renderings, not simple factual reports.
But the critique didn't stop at theoretical bias. It targeted the entire power structure of the relationship between the researcher and the research the observer observed asymmetry.
This was a fundamental critique of the power dynamics. The entire realist enterprise was built on this distinction. The researcher maximized control, possessing the superior knowledge and the means of knowledge production.
And the observed were just passive research objects.
Basically, yeah. They were often lacking agency in the process. And, crucially, they were not expected to read the research report. And in many colonial or poverty contexts, they weren't literate. The researcher alone held the knowledge to describe the social world accurately.
So the report was written about them, but the audience, footing number 5, was always the scholarly community, not the community that was studied.
That's the asymmetry in text production. Reports were written to satisfy the epistemological standards of social scientists, often completely overlooking the people whose lives were being detailed. The success and validity of the research were judged solely by the scholarly community.
Which we now recognize as creating deep ethical and political problems regarding representation and who controls knowledge.
Absolutely.
And this hidden asymmetry was ripped wide open by the most devastating shock of all, the posthumous publication of Malinowski's diary.
The shockwave that hit the discipline when Malinowski's Trobriand Island diary was published in 1967. I mean, you can't overstate it. He had been dead for years.
And the diary revealed that the heroic ethnographer, the detached, objective narrator of Argonauts, was a carefully crafted, deliberate
It's a
performance.
complete
What
performance.
was revealed in those private pages that was so damaging to the ideal of the objective ethnographer?
The diary contained these expressions of profound personal struggle, alienation, homesickness, lust, frustration, and just intense hostility toward the people he was studying.
And he recorded incredibly racist language.
He did. There was the infamous line, "I was fed up with the niggers and with my work."
That exposure just, it fundamentally challenged the credibility of the entire methodological ideal. How could he possibly claim to have grasped the native's point of view while harboring such deep-seated bias and contempt?
He couldn't. It shattered the illusion of detachment and unbiased observation. The diary proved that personal biases, emotional struggles, and complex power dynamics were fundamental to the fieldwork process, yet they had been systematically sanitized and erased from the official realist text.
So this forced a radical reevaluation of the fourth footing, the rhetorical content of the research report.
The reports could no longer claim to be just objective facts. They were products of a profoundly personal, often fraught, relationship with the people being studied.
This crisis immediately required a new way of research reporting, one that demanded what we now call reflexivity.
Absolutely. The Malinowski diary fundamentally altered research ethics and methodology forever. It made it clear that the ethnographer had an ethical obligation to acknowledge their own standpoint, their biases, their struggles, and the ways the power dynamics of their personal presence influenced the data they collected.
The era of the anonymous hidden observer was over.
It was over. The ethnographer's humanity, for better or worse, had to be written into the text.
Okay, so the crisis of authority in the 1960s and 70s was a necessary, if painful, reckoning. If detachment was a lie and objectivity was a dangerous myth, researchers had to find new ethical and methodological ways forward. The immediate response was this better evidence movement that prioritized involvement over detached observation.
This movement was really defined by action research. The model shifted dramatically. The researcher was no longer this neutral presence merely observing.
They were an active participant.
Yes, working collaboratively with members of a setting to effect practical change. And this was applied across all sorts of fields like agriculture, factory organization, public health research, designed to generate immediate localized impact.
So it's a rejection of purely academic knowledge accumulation in favor of practical application and social change.
It was. And this quickly evolved into participatory action research, or PAR, where the roles of researchers and the research became explicitly blended.
So the people being studied were transformed into active collaborators.
Or joint authors, or dedicated advocates for the research findings. PAR was a direct assault on that traditional observer-observed asymmetry, validating the insider perspective as central to the inquiry itself.
Okay, so that's one path. But simultaneously, the political fallout from the crisis led to the emergence of critical ethnography, which moved far beyond just blurring roles and adopted an explicit value position.
Right. Critical ethnography completely rejected the golden age ideal of value neutrality.
Arguing that neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity.
Exactly. It was influenced heavily by neo-Marxist social analysis, by critical theory, figures like Paulo Freire, and its focus became domination and oppression.
And the aim here wasn't just to describe oppression, but to explain how material or cultural influences prevent people from taking action, often through concepts like cultural influences that deflect critique or the structure of false consciousness.
You've got it. Critical ethnography focuses heavily on structural issues: race, class, gender, colonization, sexuality. It aims to reveal how systems are designed to benefit dominant groups.
And the critical ethnographer takes a stance of political solidarity.
They do, actively connecting with informants' viewpoints on systems of inequity. The goal is emancipation, not just documentation. This marked a major departure, replacing detached realism with politically engaged advocacy.
So we have the shift toward participation and the shift toward political critique. But then came this intellectual tidal wave of post-structuralism and postmodernism, which questioned not just the researchers' ethics, but the fundamental authority of the text they produced.
The late 1970s and 1980s brought this intellectual storm fueled by philosophers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, and they questioned the very foundations of human agency and the Enlightenment tradition.
So if you're questioning the authority of language, history, and the coherence of the individual human subject,
then the entire realist project is immediately jeopardized.
If Foucault argues that power is present in all knowledge and social structures, then even a local interaction in a village is not just a localized custom, but a manifestation of broader systems of control.
That's precisely the realization that led to deconstruction. Postmodernism challenged the authority of realist narrative accounts, arguing that social structures and power dynamics are embedded even in local, seemingly benign interactions.
And Foucault showed how power operated through surveillance and knowledge systems.
The very systems that underpin the idea of dispassionate, objective helping professions like medicine or education. These critiques necessitated a radical change in the research text itself.
So no more third-person anonymous narrator. The narrative had to shift to acknowledge the author's standpoint, sometimes featuring the researcher as a character.
Exactly. The move was toward reflexivity and transparency. We see the rise of autoethnography, where the author's own experience is central, and researchers deliberately demystify the text by acknowledging their subjectivity.
And there were early examples of this shift creeping in, even before the postmodern turn was fully recognized.
Oh, yeah. Like William White, including an extensive appendix in the second edition of Street Corner Society to describe the agonizing details of his personal fieldwork experience. That was a huge deal at the time.
And even fictionalized accounts became valuable tools to convey the emotional, subjective reality that the realist texts had suppressed.
Yes, fiction, or research written in a highly literary style, became a means of illuminating the intense emotional and ethical dilemmas inherent in deep fieldwork. Texts like Laura Bohannon's fictionalized memoir Return to Laughter made it clear that the detached, means-ends rationality suggested by Golden Age realism was not how fieldwork actually operated.
So the crisis exposed the literary nature of all ethnography.
And it prompted researchers to intentionally leverage literary and subjective methods to tell a different, maybe more honest kind of truth.
As all these theoretical debates were raging in anthropology and sociology, qualitative methods were being rapidly integrated into applied fields. And the biggest example of that was educational research in the mid to late 20th century.
That's right. Qualitative methods began entering education in earnest in the 1950s and 60s, driven by researchers like L. Smith, George Spindler, and Philip Jackson.
And they saw the potential right away.
They did. They quickly recognized that ethnographic practice was essential for studying complex classroom environments and the highly localized, nuanced cultures of schools, which, quantitative testing metrics simply couldn't capture.
Why did the classroom specifically require an ethnographic approach? What's so special about that setting?
Because pedagogy and learning are inherently interactional, meaning laden processes. You can measure test scores, that's the EDIC outcome.
Right.
But to understand why students are succeeding or failing, you need to understand the emic reality, the hidden curriculum, the subtle power dynamics between teachers and students, and how language is used to structure knowledge.
And the technological leaps of the 1960s with portable video and audio equipment were crucial here.
They were, allowing researchers to conduct this intensive, meticulous classroom observation and discourse analysis, focusing on interactional sociolinguistics, how specific words and gestures affected learning outcomes.
And a lot of this early research was supported by major bodies like the National Science Foundation, the NSF, which suggests they initially saw its value. But that value judgment became heavily contested in the 1990s and 2000s.
It did. It led to intense pressure for qualitative inquiry to conform to hard science metrics.
This pressure was immense, particularly in applied fields like education, medicine, and business, where policy decisions required evidence.
And this culminated in the push for scientifically based research, or SBR. Organizations like the American Educational Research Association adopted these definitions of SBR that emphasized rigorous, systematic, and objective methodologies, reliability and validity, a logical chain of reasoning, and designs that provide reliable and generalizable findings.
Now, this language sounds inherently rigorous. Who could argue with that? But how did this SBR framework implicitly penalize qualitative research?
Because that SBR definition carried an explicit bias toward the methodology of physical science, which in practice often translated into favoring randomized controlled trials, or RCTs.
Right, the gold standard in medicine.
Exactly. The language of reliability and generalizability and the search for clear causal mechanisms X causes Y is perfectly suited for testing medical treatments or physical phenomena where you can isolate variables.
But social phenomena, as Dilthey argued over a century before, are not isolated and constant.
They're not. So the core argument from policymakers became, if you want to determine which teaching method is most effective, the most reliable and generalizable way is to use the RC2 model, a control group versus a treatment group. This put qualitative inquiry in a highly defensive position, forced to justify its utility when it was never designed to find generalized causal laws independent of context.
And this debate forced academics to re-articulate the very purpose of social inquiry. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz issued a strong warning against this kind of reductionism.
Geertz warned in 2001 that applying a broad umbrella concept of science to social inquiry was, frankly, pointless. He argued that forcing the study of society under the same methodological tent as string theory was a dangerous reductionism because the differences in the object of study, the meaning-laden human consciousness, are simply too fundamental to ignore.
This intellectual counterargument led to the revitalization of a very ancient concept, dating all the way back to Aristotle, phronesis.
This is a crucial concept for understanding the modern justification of qualitative research. Aristotle defined three types of knowledge.
Okay.
There's episteme, which is universal, cumulative knowledge like physics or math. There's techne, which is technical, craft-based, pragmatic knowledge like building a bridge. And then there's phronesis.
Which he defined as practical wisdom or prudence.
Exactly. The situational knowledge of a wise statesman or a craftsman.
And the argument made by thinkers like Bent Fleibberg is that social inquiry, especially when it's applied to policy, should be guided by phronesis, not episteme.
That's the core claim. Hard science, which is aligned with the SBRCT model, seeks causal mechanisms. X causes Y in general. Frenetic inquiry, by contrast, seeks to address specific, local values, power dynamics, and practical details relevant to policy decision-making. It asks questions of value and action rather than just causation.
Let's use the sources example of the Aalborg traffic flow study to make this distinction completely concrete for you, the listener. How does the SBR model fail here, and how does phronesis succeed?
Okay, so if you approach the traffic issues in Aalborg, Denmark, using the SBR-RCT model, you might run an experiment. Does increasing the number of bike lanes, that's X,
Yeah.
increase bicycle ridership, that's Y?
And you might find, generally, yes, it does. Based on studies in various cities, that's episteme general causal knowledge.
Right, but knowing that X causes Y in general doesn't tell the Aalborg City Council what they should do.
Right. It's not actionable on its own.
Exactly. A frenetic inquiry, by contrast, has to ask, where are we going? Is this specific plan desirable for Aalborg? What specific action should we take? And to answer this, you need a deep, situated knowledge of that local ecosystem.
So you need the history of the city, the culture of pedestrian interaction, the demographic shifts.
The political power dynamics affecting where public funds are allocated, the geographic constraints of that particular urban space, all of it.
So SBR tells you what might happen in theory. Phronesis tells you what you should do in this specific moment, based on local knowledge and values.
The frenetic researcher doesn't seek generalizability. They seek context-specific practical knowledge that is necessary for wise political or social action. It's research guided by questions of value and power. What values are served by this traffic plan? Who gains power? Who loses?
It moves us fundamentally away from the value-neutral ideal of the physical science model and roots social inquiry firmly in interpretation and practical ethics.
That's the argument.
We've traced this amazing journey from ancient relativism to social physics through Malinowski's crisis and into this modern debate over what constitutes scientific validity and value. So where does qualitative inquiry stand today after absorbing all those critiques and confronting the pressure of SBR?
The field today is fundamentally characterized by a bifurcation. It reflects the unresolved tensions between realism, critical theory, and postmodernism. We really see two major streams continuing to thrive.
Okay, let's look at the first stream, the continuations of established methodologies.
This stream maintains methodological rigor while adapting to the demands of reflexivity and collaboration. So realist ethnography still persists, especially in pragmatic, applied fields like nursing, medicine, and business, where clear descriptions of practice are vital.
Makes sense.
Critical ethnography continues its strong focus on power and oppression. And importantly, collaborative action research and indigenous research perspectives emphasize the insider view, actively empowering the researched as co-creators of knowledge, directly challenging that golden age asymmetry.
And the second stream, the postmodern and literary approaches.
These are the methods that fully embrace the crisis of the text. We see the flourishing of autoethnography, which centers the author's standpoint, performance ethnography, which uses dramatic or theatrical staging to illuminate findings, and various arts-based approaches.
And these methods treat the research report not as a detached, objective portrait,
but as a literary means of illuminating subjective and interpretive truths. often using poetic or literary techniques to convey meaning that traditional academic prose simply cannot capture.
It sounds like the role of the researcher has permanently shifted from that detached expert to a much more subjective participant.
Absolutely. The traditional model of the autonomous social scientist is challenged in almost every corner of the field. Today's researcher is often an insider or explicitly acknowledges their situatedness, blurring the line between who is studied and who is studying.
And the reports themselves are now accepted as partial renderings.
Yes, filtered through the standpoint of the researcher, rather than being comprehensive, realistic portraits. The focus is on understanding and illuminating truths with a sense of humility.
And the ghost of Malinowski is still present, a constant reminder of the failure of that objective ideal.
The source notes the deep irony of it all. The figure who set the standard for objective, deep fieldwork remains relevant 100 years later, precisely because his secret diary forced a necessary, painful critique of realism and detachment.
So his legacy demands that the qualitative researcher cultivate constant self-reflection or reflexivity.
It does, and maybe the key takeaway is that learning new things and sharing that knowledge, the essential joy of discovery, is more important than strictly conforming to a normal science paradigm that requires the suppression of the human element.
We started this deep dive by looking at the tension between quantifying things, quantitas, and understanding meaning, qualitas. Our history has shown that the path toward capturing meaning was intellectually messy, riddled with ethical pitfalls, and constantly required introspection about power dynamics and textual authority.
And that is the critical takeaway for you, the listener, regardless of your field. Critical thinking is essential because knowledge is so profoundly shaped by the perspective and the power position of the knowledge producer.
And the fact that the validity of research is constantly being questioned and redefined, that's not a bad thing.
No, it shouldn't be interpreted as methodological failure. It's a sign of intellectual health and vitality. The field is maturing precisely because it is willing to question its own foundations.
So, the history of qualitative inquiry has always been about whether the study of human social life can ever be reduced to a seamless, stable science like physics.
And the source observes that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. We began with Comte attempting to build a social physics grounded in the search for general predictive laws. The entire trajectory of qualitative inquiry, with its necessary turns toward recognizing power dynamics, embracing deconstruction, and advocating for practical wisdom, phronesis, suggests a powerful, provocative thought for you to take away. What does this entire history suggest about the ultimate viability of a purely objective science of human social life that attempts to stand fully apart from the messy, complex, meaning-laden flow of everyday experience? It suggests that the complexity of humanity fundamentally requires constant adaptation, humility, and perpetual questioning from those who seek to understand it. That struggle, in the end, is the science.